The marble halls of the downtown courthouse echoed with May Nguyen's footsteps as she struggled to balance an enormous stack of leather-bound law books in her arms. Her brother's navy suit jacket, borrowed just hours earlier, hung slightly loose around her shoulders, and the sleeves extended past her wrists. Despite the ill-fitting attire, she walked with determination, her chin held high. The security guard at the metal detector raised his eyebrows at the sight of the petite young woman nearly hidden behind her tower of books. "Miss, the law library is on the 3rd floor," he said, his voice gentle but condescending. Mai shook her head, shifting the weight of the books to one arm as she handed him her court summons. "Courtroom 4B, please," she said, her voice clear and steady. The guard's expression changed from confusion to surprise as he reviewed the document. He gestured toward the detector, watching as she carefully maneuvered her precious cargo through security. The elevator ride to the 4th floor gave May a moment to catch her breath. She checked her reflection in the polished metal walls, quickly tucking a stray strand of black hair behind her ear. The morning rush hour traffic had made her early arrival turn into barely on time, but she refused to let that shake her confidence. When the elevator doors opened, Mai followed the signs to Courtroom 4B. The heavy wooden doors creaked as she pushed through them with her shoulder, drawing the attention of everyone inside. The room was larger than she imagined, with high ceilings and rows of polished wooden benches. Morning sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting long shadows across the floor. Judge Thompson, a man in his 60s with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses, looked up from his papers at the commotion. His eyes widened slightly at the sight of Mai, who was now attempting to navigate the narrow aisle while keeping her tower of books from toppling. A few snickers echoed from the gallery as she stumbled slightly, but she kept her balance. "Young lady," Judge Thompson called out, his voice filling the courtroom, "the courthouse library has plenty of space for studying. This is a courtroom in session." He gestured toward the door, clearly expecting her to leave. Mai finally reached the front tables and carefully set down her stack of books. The sound of leather binding meeting wooden table echoed through the now quiet room. She straightened her brother's suit jacket and turned to face the judge. "Your Honor, I'm May Nguyen, here for case number 47,259, Nguyen versus Henderson." She spoke clearly, despite the nervous flutter in her stomach. The judge's expression shifted from dismissive to puzzled as he consulted his docket. From the table across the aisle, James Parker, Henderson's attorney, looked up from his expensive leather briefcase. His perfectly tailored suit and gold watch screamed success, and the smirk playing at the corners of his mouth showed exactly what he thought of the young woman in the borrowed suit. "Miss Nguyen," Judge Thompson said, peering at her over his reading glasses, "where is your attorney?" His tone suggested he was already losing patience with what he assumed would be a waste of the court's time. Mai squared her shoulders and met his gaze directly. "Your Honor, I'll be representing myself today." The words rang out clear and confident, despite the fresh wave of whispers and barely concealed laughter that rippled through the courtroom. Judge Thompson's eyebrows shot up toward his hairline as he leaned back in his chair, a mixture of amusement and disbelief crossing his face. "You plan to represent yourself in a property dispute case?" He glanced at the stack of books beside her. "This isn't a study session at the local library, Miss Nguyen. This is a court of law." Mai opened her first law book with steady hands, the gold leaf page edges catching the morning light. The courtroom clerk called out the case number, his voice echoing off the wood-paneled walls. "Case number 47,259, Nguyen versus Henderson, regarding property line dispute and commercial zoning regulations." James Parker rose smoothly from his chair, adjusting his Italian silk tie with manicured fingers. "James Parker, representing Mr. Henderson," he announced, his voice carrying the easy confidence of someone who'd won countless similar cases. He cast a sideways glance at Mai, the corner of his mouth twitching with barely concealed amusement. Judge Thompson nodded at Parker before turning his attention to May. "Miss Nguyen, for the record, are you certain you wish to proceed without legal representation? The court can provide resources for finding suitable counsel." His tone carried the weight of 20 years on the bench, heavy with the implication that she was making a grave mistake. May stood, her borrowed jacket catching slightly on the chair. "Yes, Your Honor, I'm prepared to represent myself." She pulled out a carefully tabbed document. "I've prepared a brief outlining my position with relevant case law citations." She approached the bench with copies, her shoes clicking against the polished floor in the now silent courtroom. Parker accepted his copy with perfectly concealed disdain, but his eyes widened slightly as he scanned the first page. The brief was immaculate, formatted with precision that would impress a senior partner at any law firm. The margins contained careful annotations in neat handwriting, referencing specific legal precedents. "Very well," Judge Thompson said, adjusting his reading glasses. "Mr. Parker, you may present your opening statement." He settled back, clearly expecting a quick resolution to what he viewed as a simple case. Parker stood and buttoned his suit jacket with practiced ease. "Your Honor, this is a straightforward matter of property encroachment. My client, Mr. Henderson, has documentation showing clear ownership of the disputed land dating back 15 years. The Nguyen family's recent commercial activities have expanded beyond their legal boundaries, creating both a zoning issue and a clear property violation." As Parker spoke, May took notes with fierce concentration, her pen moving rapidly across her legal pad. She didn't react to his dismissive glances or the way he emphasized commercial activities with slight derision. Instead, she calmly opened another book, cross-referencing something in the margins. When Parker finished his polished opening statement, Judge Thompson turned to May. "Miss Nguyen, your opening statement." His tone suggested he expected either confusion or a fumbling attempt at legal argument. May stood, her posture straight despite her ill-fitting suit. "Your Honor, this case is about more than property lines drawn on paper. It's about the intersection of historical land use, modern zoning regulations, and the rights of established businesses." She pulled out a document with colored tabs. "I have here the original property surveys from 1985, which show something fascinating that Mr. Parker's evidence conveniently overlooks." The judge leaned forward slightly, his interest sparked by her confident tone and specific reference. Parker's smile faltered as May began laying out documents on her table with precise movements. The whispers in the gallery died down as she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "When we examined these surveys alongside the current property claims," May continued, pulling out a large rolled paper from beside her stack of books, "we find a significant discrepancy that changes the entire nature of this dispute." May unrolled the large survey map across her table, weighing down the corners with her law books. The yellow paper crinkled softly in the hushed courtroom. "Your Honor, if I may approach with the survey." She gathered several colored sticky notes from her folder, each marked with different dates and annotations. Judge Thompson nodded, his earlier amusement replaced by curiosity. As May spread the survey across his bench, he leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. Parker stood and moved closer, his expensive shoes clicking against the floor. "This survey from 1892, May began, pointing to a faded line on the map, shows the original property division when this area was first developed. Notice this natural boundary marker here." Her finger traced a curved line. "It follows the creek bed that once ran through this area." Parker cleared his throat. "Your Honor, I fail to see the relevance of a survey that's over a century old." His voice carried a hint of nervous energy that hadn't been there before. May smiled softly. "The relevance, Mr. Parker, becomes clear when we overlay the modern survey." She carefully placed a transparent sheet over the original map. The creek was diverted in 1923, but according to property law established in Waterston versus Miller, 1875, natural boundaries remain legal markers unless explicitly redrawn through proper channels. Judge Thompson's eyebrows rose as he followed her explanation. The gallery had grown completely silent, all eyes fixed on the young woman in the oversized suit who spoke with such quiet authority. "I have here," May continued, pulling out another document, the complete chain of title transfers from 1892 to present day. Not once was the original creek bed boundary legally redefined. She handed copies to the judge and Parker. This means Mr. Henderson's claim to the disputed area is based on an incorrect assumption about where his property actually begins. Parker frantically flipped through the documents, his earlier confidence crumbling. Your Honor, this is, he struggled to find a rebuttal. It wasn't finished. She pulled out a thick book, opening it to a marked page. Furthermore, in the case of Chen versus Riverfront Properties, 1983, the California Supreme Court ruled that historical natural boundaries take precedence over modern property lines unless explicitly addressed in subsequent deed transfers. She handed the book to the judge, who accepted it with visible interest. Miss Nguyen, Judge Thompson said, studying the case law, where did you learn about these precedents? His tone had transformed from condescending to genuinely impressed. Mai straightened her brother's jacket sleeve. I spent 3 months in the law library, Your Honor. Every evening after closing the restaurant, I researched property law. I found 17 cases specifically addressing historical natural boundaries and their modern implications. She pulled out another folder, this one filled with neatly organized case summaries. The whispers in the gallery had changed from mocking to admiring. Even the court reporter had stopped typing momentarily, caught up in the unexpected display of legal expertise. But the most interesting precedent, May continued, opening another law book to a marked page, comes from right here in our own district. The 1957 case of Martinez versus the Downtown Development Corporation established that commercial property rights derived from historical natural boundaries cannot be superseded without explicit agreement from all affected parties. She looked directly at Parker. My family never agreed to any boundary changes, Mr. Parker. Did your client have documentation showing otherwise? Parker tugged at his collar, suddenly looking less comfortable in his expensive suit. The judge leaned back in his chair, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth as he watched the seasoned attorney struggle to counter the young woman's meticulous research. Parker shuffled through his papers, the crisp sound of rustling documents filling the tense courtroom. Your Honor, while Miss Nguyen's historical research is impressive, we have more recent documentation. He pulled out a folder with his client's logo embossed on the cover. Mr. Henderson's recent land survey clearly shows. If I may, Your Honor, May interjected politely, reaching into her worn backpack. She withdrew a sealed envelope with the City Planning Department's official stamp. I have something that might interest the court regarding that recent survey. Judge Thompson nodded, his eyes bright with interest. Proceed, Miss Nguyen. Mai broke the seal and carefully removed several photographs, along with official-looking documents. These photos were taken by the City Planning Department during their annual property assessment 3 months ago. She approached the bench, laying out the photos in sequence. Notice the date stamps in the corner, Your Honor. The judge leaned forward, studying the images. Parker moved closer, his confidence visibly wavering. The photos showed the disputed area from various angles, each one clearly dated before Henderson's construction project began. Now, if you look at this city planning document, May continued, her voice steady and clear, you'll see that no construction permits were filed for boundary adjustments in this area. She placed the document next to the photos. According to City Ordinance 47.3, subsection B, any modification to commercial property lines requires prior approval and proper permits. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Parker tugged at his tie, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. Your Honor, my client was under the impression that. The impressions of your client, Mr. Parker, May said gently, don't override city regulations. She opened another law book to a marked page. In fact, the case of Rodriguez versus City Planning Commission, 2018, established that commercial property owners bear full responsibility for verifying boundary adjustments with city authorities before beginning any construction. Judge Thompson removed his glasses, polishing them thoughtfully. Mr. Parker, did your client obtain these necessary permits? Parker glanced desperately at his notes. Well, Your Honor, The process was, that is to say, we were in the preliminary stages of. To save the court's time, May interrupted smoothly, producing another document. I have here the complete record of permit applications for this district over the past year. She handed copies to both the judge and Parker. You'll notice there's no application from Mr. Henderson or his company. The judge flipped through the pages, nodding slowly. Parker's face had turned an interesting shade of red as he realized the gravity of this oversight. Furthermore, May continued, pulling out her final piece of evidence. I have here time-stamped photographs showing the progression of Mr. Henderson's fence construction. She laid them out in sequence. Note how it gradually encroaches on our property, day by day, without any official supervision or permits. The gallery buzzed with whispers. Several attorneys who had been watching from the back of the courtroom were now taking notes, clearly impressed by the young woman's methodical presentation. Judge Thompson held up one of the photos. Miss Nguyen, these photographs are remarkably thorough. How did you manage to document this so precisely? Mai smiled slightly. I set up a camera in our restaurant's kitchen window, Your Honor. It took photos every hour during daylight. She gestured to the timestamps. I believed it was important to create a clear record of the encroachment. Parker sank into his chair, loosening his tie. His client, Mr. Henderson, sitting in the gallery, looked increasingly uncomfortable as he watched his expensive lawyer being systematically outmaneuvered by a young woman in a borrowed suit. The afternoon sun slanted through the high courtroom windows, casting long shadows across May's stack of law books. She stood again, her voice growing stronger with each word. Your Honor, I'd like to present 3 precedent cases that, when viewed together, create an interesting perspective on property rights in commercial zones. Judge Thompson gestured for her to continue, settling back in his chair with genuine interest. The afternoon heat had caused several spectators to leave, but the remaining audience leaned forward, captivated by the unexpected legal drama unfolding before them. First, May began, opening a weathered law book. We have Thompson versus Oakland City Council, 1962. This established that commercial property rights must be balanced against community interest. She placed the book on the judge's bench, carefully marked with colorful tabs. The ruling specifically mentioned the importance of preserving established local businesses. Parker started to object, but May smoothly continued. This brings me to the second case, Riverside Markets versus Development Board, 1985. She lifted another book, this one newer but equally well marked. Here, the court recognized that long-standing businesses create what they called community anchors that deserve special consideration in property disputes. The judge nodded thoughtfully, making notes. Even the court reporter had slowed her typing, absorbed in May's presentation. From the gallery, Mr. Henderson shifted uncomfortably in his seat, whispering urgently to his assistant. But the most compelling connection, May said, pulling out her final reference, comes from Zhang versus Metropolitan Planning Commission, 2019. This recent case directly addressed the rights of family-owned businesses operating continuously in the same location for over 20 years. She paused, touching the simple jade pendant at her neck, her mother's lucky charm. Your Honor, my parents opened Golden Dragon Restaurant 22 years ago. We've served this community through 3 recessions, 2 earthquakes, and a pandemic. Our customers watched me grow up between those tables. The elderly couple on the 3rd floor of the apartment building next door has ordered the same dinner every Friday for 15 years. The courtroom had fallen completely silent. Even Parker had stopped shuffling his papers, caught up in the personal element of May's argument. The Zhang case ruled that such establishments create what the court called irreplaceable community value. May continued, her voice clear and passionate. This value must be weighed heavily in any property dispute that might threaten their operation. Judge Thompson removed his glasses, studying May with new respect. Miss Nguyen, your legal analysis is quite sophisticated. Have you had any formal legal training? Mai straightened her brother's jacket sleeve. No, Your Honor, but every night after closing, I would sit at table 7, our lucky table, and study these law books. I learned about property law, zoning regulations, and legal precedents while my mother prepared tomorrow's marinades and my father calculated inventory. She gestured to her stack of books. Each of these was purchased from used bookstores or borrowed from the public law library. I spent 6 months studying them, taking notes between serving customers and helping in the kitchen. Our restaurant isn't just a business, Your Honor. It's our family's dream, our customers' second home, and a piece of our community's heart. The judge glanced at Parker, who had the grace to look somewhat ashamed of his earlier condescension. From the gallery, several regular customers of the Golden Dragon restaurant, who had come to support May, nodded in agreement, their faces showing pride in the young woman they'd watched grow up. The afternoon shadows lengthened across the courtroom floor as Mai moved into her closing arguments. She gathered her courage, knowing it was time to share the full story behind her legal knowledge. The weight of her acceptance letter to Yale Law School felt heavy in her backpack, still unopened and waiting for the right moment. Your Honor, May began, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Before we conclude, I feel I should explain something about my preparation for this case. She touched the worn spine of the nearest law book, its pages bristling with dozens of colored markers. Judge Thompson leaned forward, curiosity evident in his expression. The remaining spectators, including several young law clerks who had slipped into the back rows during their lunch break, waited in anticipation. 6 months ago, when Mr. Henderson's company first began their construction, I knew nothing about property law. Mai smiled slightly, remembering those first overwhelming days. I worked during the day at our restaurant, serving pho and spring rolls, memorizing customer orders, and calculating tips. She gestured to the stack of legal texts beside her. But every night after we closed at 10, I would clear table 7, our lucky table, and spread out these books. I taught myself about easements and property rights while my mother prepared tomorrow's broth in the kitchen. I learned about zoning laws as my father counted the day's receipts. Parker had stopped taking notes, his expensive pen lying forgotten on his legal pad. Even Mr. Henderson, still sitting in the gallery, seemed captured by May's story. I found these books at used bookstores and library sales, she continued, touching each one gently. The owner of the local law library, Mrs. Martinez, noticed me coming in every weekend. She started saving relevant cases for me, teaching me how to read court decisions and understand legal terminology. Mai pulled out a carefully preserved library card, showing it to the judge. I've read 342 property law cases in the past 6 months, Your Honor. I took notes on every single one, organizing them by relevance to our situation. When I couldn't afford to copy cases, I would handwrite them, page by page, sitting at that lucky table after hours. The judge studied her with growing admiration. Miss Nguyen, your dedication is remarkable. But what drove you to take on such an enormous task by yourself? Mai straightened her shoulders. My parents mortgaged everything to open Golden Dragon restaurant. They worked 18-hour days, learned English from their customers, and put every spare penny into my education. Her voice grew stronger, filled with quiet pride. When this property dispute threatened everything they'd built, I couldn't let them down. She reached into her backpack, finally withdrawing the envelope she'd been carrying for weeks. And yesterday, Your Honor, I received this. She carefully opened the envelope, removing the letter inside. It's an acceptance letter from Yale Law School, with a full scholarship. A murmur of appreciation rippled through the courtroom. Judge Thompson smiled broadly, while Parker sat up straighter, reassessing the young woman who had outmaneuvered him with self-taught legal expertise. I didn't open it until this morning, May admitted, her eyes bright. I wanted to face this challenge on my own merits, not with the weight of a future law school's name behind me. This case wasn't about my future legal career. It was about protecting my family's dream and our place in this community. Judge Thompson removed his glasses, polishing them thoughtfully before addressing the courtroom. The late afternoon sun cast a warm glow through the windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air. Every person in the room held their breath, waiting for his decision. In my 20 years on this bench, he began, his voice carrying the weight of experience, I have rarely seen such thorough preparation and compelling argumentation, especially from someone without formal legal training. He placed his glasses back on and lifted May's carefully prepared brief. May sat perfectly still, her hands folded on the table before her. She could feel the presence of her parents who had slipped into the back of the courtroom during her final arguments, still wearing their restaurant aprons. Miss Nguyen has not only demonstrated a superior understanding of property law, but has also presented clear, irrefutable evidence of permit violations and unauthorized construction. The judge turned his attention to Parker and his client. Mr. Henderson's failure to obtain proper permits, combined with the documented encroachment on the Nguyen family's property, shows a troubling disregard for both legal procedures and community interests. Parker shifted uncomfortably in his expensive chair, while Mr. Henderson's face grew increasingly red. The judge continued, his voice firm and clear. Therefore, I rule in favor of the defendant, May Nguyen, representing Golden Dragon Restaurant. Mr. Henderson's construction must cease immediately, and the fence must be removed within 7 days. He paused, reviewing his notes. Furthermore, given the documented expenses incurred by the Nguyen family in defending their property rights, I am ordering Mr. Henderson to cover all legal fees and associated costs. A soft murmur of approval rippled through the gallery. May's mother dabbed at her eyes with a corner of her apron, while her father stood straighter, pride evident in his bearing. Miss Nguyen, Judge Thompson added, a warm smile softening his usually stern features, would you approach the bench? May rose gracefully, her brother's borrowed suit no longer seeming ill-fitting, but rather a symbol of her family's support. As she approached, the judge leaned forward, speaking quietly, but with clear admiration. Yale Law School is gaining an exceptional student, he said, reaching for his business card. I'd like you to contact my office about a summer internship position. We need minds like yours in our judicial system. Before Mai could respond, Parker hurried forward, straightening his silk tie. Miss Nguyen, he said, extending his hand, my firm would also be very interested in discussing your future plans. Your analysis of the historical property laws was remarkably insightful. Mai shook both their hands professionally, but her eyes drifted to the back of the courtroom where her parents stood. Their faces beamed with pride, and she could see her mother already planning a celebration dinner in her head. The gallery began to clear, but several law clerks lingered, hoping to speak with May. Mr. Henderson, looking thoroughly chastened, approached her with an unexpected humility. Miss Nguyen, he said quietly, I owe your family an apology. Would you consider letting me make it over dinner at your restaurant? I hear the pho is exceptional. May smiled graciously, gathering her books. Table 7 is our lucky table, she replied. It's available tomorrow at 6. She picked up her acceptance letter from Yale, finally allowing herself to feel the full weight of her victory. Not just for herself, but for her family, their restaurant, and every person who had ever been underestimated. The evening sun cast a golden glow through the windows of Golden Dragon Restaurant, where Table 7 had become something of a local legend. 1 month after the courtroom victory, Mai sat at her lucky table, now surrounded by law books and study materials for her upcoming first semester at Yale. The bell above the door chimed as Judge Thompson entered, removing his jacket in the warm evening air. He had become a regular customer, often bringing young law clerks with him to discuss cases over steaming bowls of pho. Tonight, he carried a thick envelope bearing the court's official seal. May, he called out warmly, making his way to Table 7. I have something you might be interested in. He placed the envelope beside her LSAT prep books. The Bar Association was quite impressed by the transcript of your case. Mai opened the envelope carefully, her eyes widening as she read. The local Bar Association had created a scholarship fund for aspiring lawyers from immigrant families, naming it the Nguyen Excellence in Law Scholarship. The first recipient would be chosen next spring. At the counter, May's mother beamed with pride as she prepared the judge's usual order. The restaurant had become busier than ever, with law students from nearby universities claiming that studying at Table 7 brought good luck during exam season. There's more, Judge Thompson said, accepting a cup of green tea. James Parker called me this morning. His firm has decided to offer pro bono services to family-owned businesses facing property disputes. He smiled knowingly. Apparently, your case made quite an impression on him. The front window, where Mai had once positioned her camera to document the fence construction, now displayed a framed copy of her Yale acceptance letter alongside a newspaper article about her courtroom victory. Local business owners often stopped by to seek her advice, pulling up chairs around table 7 to discuss their legal concerns. Mr. Henderson had become an unexpected ally. After his apologetic dinner at the restaurant, he had started referring his business associates to Golden Dragon. He even helped May's father navigate the permit process for expanding their outdoor seating area. Miss Nguyen, a young voice called. May looked up to see Lisa, a high school student who had been shadowing her for a school project. I got accepted to pre-law. The girl's excitement filled the restaurant, and several regular customers applauded. May's father emerged from the kitchen, carrying a special celebration dish. He had started preparing these surprise meals for customers who shared good news at table 7. The tradition had begun the night May received her Yale acceptance letter. The restaurant had transformed into more than just a place to eat. Table 7 hosted informal legal clinics on weekend mornings where Mai helped local residents understand their rights. Law books mingled with menus, and the sound of legal discussions blended with the clinking of chopsticks. As the evening wrapped up, Mai gathered her study materials, making space for the dinner rush. She paused to straighten the small plaque that now hung above table 7. Dream big, study hard, and never let anyone underestimate you. Judge Thompson finished his pho and stood to leave. You know, May, he said thoughtfully, sometimes the greatest victories aren't just about winning cases. They're about changing perspectives and opening doors for others. May nodded, watching Lisa excitedly share her college acceptance news with other customers. The borrowed suit from that day in court hung framed on the restaurant wall, alongside her first legal brief, a reminder that determination and dignity could overcome any prejudice. The jade pendant at her neck caught the last rays of sunset as she smiled, knowing that her victory had become something larger than herself. It had become a beacon of hope and inspiration for others daring to dream beyond society's expectations.